Nessa counted the dead by the smell. She had been doing it since she was 12, when the Ironfang clan's wardrake swept through her village and left nothing standing taller than her knee. Now she was 24, and the smell was the same: burned stone, scorched grain, and something underneath that she had no word for and never wanted one. She pressed her sleeve over her nose and kept walking. The valley of Redmir had been alive 3 days ago. 200 people, a mill, a market that ran every 7th morning. Now it was ash and broken walls. The dragon Karath had come because the valley sat on iron veins it wanted, and it had decided that the people living above those veins were an inconvenience. Nobody had stopped it. Nobody ever stopped them. Nessa crouched beside a toppled cart and pulled a water skin from beneath it, still sealed. She tucked it into her pack and stood up. There was a sound behind her, soft, like something dragging itself across gravel, and she turned fast, knife already in hand. It was a boy, maybe 10 years old. He was sitting in the hollow of a fallen wall, knees pulled up to his chest, looking at her with eyes that had gone very flat. The kind of flat that happens when a person has finished crying and has nothing left. She sat down across from him in the ash. She did not say anything comforting. She had found that comforting words in places like this felt like an insult. She said, "Can you walk?" He nodded. "Then walk with me." His name was Pell. He said it like a question, like he was not entirely sure it still belonged to him. She told him hers and left it at that. They moved east, away from the valley, toward the ridge road that connected the outer settlements. Nessa had been walking between settlements for 2 years, carrying messages that the Flame Court's official riders refused to touch. Letters between people who had begun, quietly, to talk to each other. Not about rebellion, about survival, about whether there was a difference. She stopped twice to check the sky. Old habit. Karath had been seen flying west yesterday, according to the last message she'd carried, but dragons did not announce their routes. They went where they wanted. You watched the sky and you moved fast when the shadow came. Pell kept pace without complaint. He was thin but not slow, and he watched everything the way children who have survived something terrible tend to watch things, like the world has revealed itself as a place that requires constant attention. By mid-afternoon, they reached the ridge and found 3 other people already there. Nessa knew 2 of them, a woman named Dort, a former Flame Court record keeper who had quit the day her entire filing record of a destroyed settlement had been marked as resolved, and a man named Croft who had been a soldier's cook. Before the regiment, he served dissolved overnight when its Dragon Lord patron decided it was cheaper to let the eastern settlements defend themselves. The third person she did not know. He was older, perhaps 60, with hands that had done physical work his whole life and a stillness about him that suggested he had been waiting at this ridge for longer than today. He introduced himself as Ben. He said he had been a miner in the Ashen Peaks foothills for 30 years, working the iron veins that the dragons now claimed for themselves. He said he had watched 4 settlements be emptied to make room for extraction claims. He said he had stopped mining 6 months ago and started doing something else. Nessa asked what. He pulled a folded piece of paper from inside his coat. She unfolded it carefully. It was a map. She had seen rough maps before, but this one was different. It marked not roads or borders, but something else. The places where dragons nested, where they roosted, where they stored the iron they extracted. And beside each location, in a careful small hand, notes about timing, when they left, how long they were gone, what patterns they kept. They are old, Ben said, and they are powerful, but they are not careful because they have never had to be. Nobody said anything for a moment. Wind moved across the ridge. Pell looked at the map with the flat, attentive eyes. Nessa thought about the cart in Redmir, the sealed water skin still good beneath it. She thought about how she had learned, over 2 years of walking, that you could find useful things in ruined places if you knew what you were looking for. She thought about how every message she had ever carried between settlements had been treated as nothing by the people in power, because the people in power did not believe that the people in the outer reaches could organize anything worth paying attention to. She said, "How many people know you've been doing this?" Ben said, "Now 5. She looked around. Dort, who had kept records for a bureaucracy that had erased people, Croft, who had fed soldiers that a dragon lord had thrown away, Pell, who was 10 years old and had no village left, Ben, with his 30 years underground and his map full of patterns, and herself, a message carrier, a person who had spent 2 years moving between places no one powerful thought mattered, talking to people no one powerful thought were worth listening to. She folded the map carefully and handed it back. She said, "Tell me everything you've written down." Ben looked at her for a moment, then he sat down on the ridge stone and began to talk. Above them the sky was clear, no shadow, not today. But Nessa had learned, a long time ago, that the days without shadows were the days you used. Ben's map had one rule: he never wrote anything down that he had not seen himself. This made it slow work, 3 years of slow work, but it also meant that when Nessa spread it across a table in the back room of a grain merchant's house in the settlement of Culvert, everyone leaning over it was looking at something true. There were 9 people in the room. She had not met most of them before this morning. Dort had brought 2, a young woman who repaired roads for a living and knew every pass and ford between the outer settlements, and an old man who had once been a flame court assessor and had spent the 10 years since his retirement quietly furious about what he had spent 30 years assessing. Croft had brought 1, a former soldier named Wren, who said very little but had a quality of attention that made Nessa think he was probably the most dangerous person in the room. Ben had brought 3 people from the mining settlements, all of them hard and quiet and practical in the way that underground work makes people. Pell was there too. He had not been invited, exactly. He had simply continued walking at Nessa's side and nobody had told him to stop. He sat on a box in the corner and listened. The meeting had one subject, Karath. Specifically, Karath's iron claim, which now covered 4 valleys and was expanding. The dragon had been extracting iron from the Redmir veins for 6 weeks. It followed a pattern. Ben had documented it carefully, of returning to the nest site in the northern peaks every 4th night to sleep. A single night of sleep, deep, heavy, dragon-long sleep, then out again at first light. The old assessor, whose name was Weld, said, "You cannot fight a dragon." Nobody disagreed. Wren said very quietly, "You don't have to fight it, you have to change what it wants." This was the pivot the meeting turned on. Karath wanted iron. It wanted the iron in 4 valleys, and it was willing to level settlements to get it. If the iron became worthless to it, if it could not get the iron out, or if the cost of getting it out suddenly became too high, then it would move on. That was what Ben's 30 years underground had taught him. Dragons were not emotional about resources. They were efficient. They went where the taking was easy. The road repair woman, whose name was Solar, said she knew the extraction routes. The narrow passages the Drake teams used to haul stone out of the valley. She had built some of them. She knew exactly which ones, if blocked correctly, would make the operation take 4 times as long. Weld said that blocking extraction routes was sabotage and would bring Flame Court forces. Dort said the Flame Court had already marked Redmir as resolved and moved on. There were no forces coming to a place that officially no longer existed. This silenced Weld for a moment. They talked for 4 hours. They argued, sometimes badly, in the way people argue when they are frightened and have never done this before. The old mining men from Ben's settlements were skeptical about anything that required them to be in open country. Underground was their logic, not the surface. Croft kept asking about food and supply lines because that was how he understood the world. Solar kept pulling the conversation back to physical specifics, which Nessa was grateful for. Because every time it drifted toward the large and abstract, she felt people start to drift toward hopelessness. Wren said almost nothing the entire 4 hours. Then at the end, when they had worked out a rough shape of what they might do, he said, "Someone has to go into the nest site first to confirm the sleep pattern." Everyone in the room understood what that meant. Nessa said, "I'll go." She said it before she had finished thinking it, which she recognized later as the only way she ever would have said it at all. Wren looked at her steadily. He said, "You understand what happens if the pattern is wrong." She said yes. She went alone. Ben's map and 3 days of walking and one moment at the edge of a cliff face, looking down into a basin of enormous bones and stolen iron and the vast coiled shape of Karath asleep in the grey light of a fourth night moon. The dragon's breath came in long, slow intervals. The space between breaths was enormous, long enough that each time, for a moment, she could hear her own heartbeat. She counted, she checked the light, she did not move for 4 hours. She came back with numbers that matched Ben's map exactly. When she told Ren, he nodded once. He said, "Good." She noticed that he did not say "well done" or "brave" or any of the things people say when they think you might need to hear them. He treated what she had done as a thing that was required and that she had done correctly. She appreciated this more than she could have explained. That evening, for the first time, she let herself think about what they were actually trying to do. Not in abstract terms, concretely. A group of people with no army, no magic, no political standing, and no protection from a creature that could level a valley in an afternoon were trying to make that creature decide to go somewhere else. She thought about the sealed water skin in Redmir, still good, still useful, not because it was special, because she had looked for it. She went to sleep on a burrowed floor in Culvert, and in the morning she was the first one up. There was work to do, and the morning was always the time you used. 7 people went into the valley on the night of Karath's fourth sleep. Nessa was not supposed to be one of them. She was supposed to be at the ridge above the eastern extraction pass, watching for Drake sign and sending the signal if anything moved. But when the 7th person, one of Ben's miners, came down with fever the morning of the operation, she looked at the 6 remaining and did the simple arithmetic. You needed 7, because the stone weight they were placing required 4 pairs of hands at 2 separate points and 1 person to keep time. She put herself in the 7th slot and didn't make a speech about it. She simply picked up the load and walked. Solar led them down. She had designed a route that used the natural drainage channels of the valley floor to muffle sound. Stone against stone carries a long way in still air, but running water carries it nowhere. They moved in single file, carrying what they needed in wrapped cloth, and the channels ran cold and fast around their boots, and nobody complained. The plan was precise because Solar was precise. 2 extraction passes blocked, not sealed. If you sealed them completely, the dragon would know immediately that it was deliberate. Instead, Solar had designed collapses that would look like natural subsidence, the ordinary giving way of old valley walls, the kind of thing that happened in iron-heavy terrain after long extractions. It would slow everything by weeks. It might buy them a month if the angles were right. A month was what they needed. What they needed a month for was harder to explain and was mostly Weld's department. The old assessor had spent his 30 years documenting everything the Flame Court ever did, including things the Flame Court would have preferred he did not notice. He had left his post with a memory full of administrative procedures that could, under the right circumstances, be turned back on the institution that had created them. One of those procedures was an iron claim dispute. Under charter law, 300-year-old charter law that most Flame Court officials had never read, any claim on a resource vein could be contested by proof of prior human settlement and habitation on that land for 2 generations or more. Redmir qualified. Weld had the records because Dort had the records because Dort had taken her files when she quit and never given them back. A claim dispute filed correctly would force a formal Flame Court review. That review would not save anyone on its own. The Flame Court did what the Dragon Lords told it to do, but it would create delay. Legal procedure was slow because it was designed to be slow, to benefit people who already had things and did not want to lose them. For once, that slowness would work the other way. They needed a month for Weld and Dort to file correctly, and for the filing to be received before Karath extracted enough iron to make the claim moot. In the valley, everything went wrong in one small way. The second extraction pass collapse was 15 minutes late because one of the miners misjudged the shoring angle and they had to reset. 15 minutes does not sound like much. In a sleeping dragon's fourth night basin, it felt like a year. Nessa stood at the timing point and counted and watched the sky and did not move and did not breathe more than she had to. Ren was at the second point with the miners. She could not see him from where she stood. She had to trust that he was doing what he said he would do. At the fourth hour, when the collapse finally happened, and the sound rolled across the valley floor like a held breath finally released, she allowed herself to exhale. They were out before first light. Nobody was caught. Nobody was injured beyond Croft cutting his palm on a rock and wrapping it with his own sleeve without comment. They climbed back up to the ridge and stood in the pre-dawn grey and said nothing to each other for a long time. Then Pell, who had somehow also not stayed where he was supposed to stay, said, "It worked." Several people looked at him. He was still 10 years old. He said it the way 10-year-olds say things that they have watched adults be too cautious to say, plainly, as fact. Ren said, "The first part worked." This was correct and important. The extraction passes would slow Karath. The claim dispute would create legal noise. But neither of those things would matter if the dragon simply decided it was easier to return to Redmir and remove the remaining humans more thoroughly. Everything depended on Karath finding the situation inconvenient enough to move on rather than press further. Dragons were efficient. They went where the taking was easy. That was the theory. Nessa had spent 2 years carrying messages in places where theory and reality didn't always match. She knew that the next part was waiting, and it was the part they couldn't fully control. She sat on the ridge stone and ate half of a hard biscuit from her pack and thought about efficiency. She thought about how Karath had leveled 4 valleys not out of rage, but out of calculation. It had decided those people were less valuable than the iron beneath them. It had made that calculation without asking, without hesitation, because no one had ever given it a reason to hesitate. The question was whether 9 people, most of whom had never done anything like this before, had managed to make a 400-year-old dragon hesitate. Below them, the valley was quiet. Above them, the sky was beginning to go pale at the edges. She ate the second half of the biscuit and waited. Karath noticed the collapses on the second day. Nessa was not in the valley when it happened. She was 3 settlements east, helping Weld prepare the claim dispute filing when the messenger arrived, a young man from one of Ben's mining settlements who had been watching from the northern ridge with instructions to run if anything changed. He ran, he arrived out of breath and told her what he had seen. Karath had landed at the first blocked extraction pass and inspected it. It had stood there for a long time, long meaning, for a dragon, something that felt geological, and then it had done something the Watcher had not expected. It had not raged. It had not burned anything. It had simply stood there very still, and then it had lifted its head and looked north, toward the other passes, toward the nest site, calculating. Then it had flown back toward the peaks. Nessa sat with this for a moment. She said, did it look like it was leaving or thinking? The Watcher said he didn't know. He had never watched a dragon think before. She sent him back with instructions to keep watching, and she turned to Weld and said, "How much time do we need?" Weld said, 3 days if nothing goes wrong. She said, "Make it 2. Weld looked at her over the papers and said, not unkindly, "I am 61 years old and I have filed more documents than you have eaten meals. Rushing a filing does not make it faster. It makes it wrong, and a wrong filing is worse than no filing." She accepted this. She sat down across the table from him and helped instead of pushing. She was not good at document work, but she was good at reading Weld's handwriting, which was small and idiosyncratic, and reading it back to him so he could catch errors saved time without introducing new ones. On the second day, Ren came in from the ridge. He said, "Karath is still at the peaks, 2 watchers confirmed, but there's a second problem." The second problem was a flame court patrol, a small one, 4 riders coming up the eastern road toward Culvert, not in response to anything they had done. A routine assessment sweep, the kind that happened every few months. Weld, when told, went very still and said, "If they find us filing this paperwork here, they will ask why, and when they find out what we are filing against, they will report it. A report reaches Drakenspire in a week. A week is too soon." They needed the filing to arrive at the Flame Court archive before a counter-report from a patrol could create noise around it. Counter-reports slowed things down. Slowed-down filings could be buried. Nessa sent Pell. She sent him because he was small and looked like nobody, and because he was the fastest runner she had watched move over 2 days of ridge travel. She put the sealed filing in a cloth bag and gave him clear instructions. The archive receiving office in the market town of Velt, 40 miles east, by road. He was to say he was delivering for his employer, give no name, and leave. Pell took the bag and looked at her with those flat eyes that had, over the past weeks, begun to unflatten slightly at the edges. He said, "What if someone stops me?" She said, "You're a kid with a bag. Nobody stops kids with bags." He left at dawn and moved fast. She knew this because she had watched him move, and because the alternative, that he had been stopped, was not something she let herself think about during the hours he was gone. The Flame Court patrol arrived in Culvert at noon. 4 riders, bored and routine, asking the standard questions about settlement population and resource production. Dort handled them. She was calm and precise and knew exactly what information to give and what to leave out, because she had sat on the other side of that kind of questioning for 30 years and understood its entire shape. They stayed for 2 hours and left without incident. Pell came back the following evening. He had walked 80 miles in 36 hours. He sat down on the floor of the back room and ate everything Croft put in front of him without speaking. When he was done, he said, "It was received." The clerk stamped it. Nobody cheered. They were too tired and too careful for cheering. But Weld made a sound under his breath that Nessa thought might have been relief, and Dort sat back in her chair in a way that suggested something had loosened in her spine. One more thing had to happen. One thing that none of them could control and none of them could substitute for. Karath had to decide that Redmir was not worth it anymore. That night, sitting by a small fire in the back of the grain merchant's house, Nessa thought about what it would look like to a dragon. Blocked passes, slower extraction, illegal filing creating noise in the administrative record, not enough to stop it, but enough to make the claim complicated. Other iron veins untouched, further north, where nobody was making things complicated. She had never met a dragon. She had only ever been beneath them, or fleeing them, or counting what they left behind. She did not know exactly how they thought. But she knew how things that were very powerful and very old thought about inconvenience. She had worked in enough places where the powerful made decisions to know. When the cost of a thing begins to feel higher than the benefit, the powerful do not dig in. They find somewhere easier. They always found somewhere easier. She stayed by the fire until it burned down, and then she went to sleep on the floor, and she slept better than she had in 3 weeks. Karath came back. Not to the extraction passes, not to the blocked routes or the nest site or anywhere Ben's map had marked. It came back to Culvert. Nessa was outside when its shadow crossed the roof. She had learned to read shadows, the way they moved, the speed of them, the size. This one was wrong, too large, too slow, not passing through. She got everyone inside in under a minute, which was faster than she would have thought possible before she had spent 6 weeks making frightened people move quickly. She pulled the door of the grain merchant's house shut and stood in the dark back room with 8 other people and Pell, and listened to the sound of something enormous landing in the market square. The sound it made settling was like a building deciding to lie down. None of them moved, none of them spoke. Croft had his hand over his mouth the way people do when they are trying not to make a sound their body wants to make. Sola had her eyes closed. Ren was watching the door with an expression Nessa could not read. Pell was watching Nessa. She held up one hand. Wait. The silence outside lasted a long time, longer than it should have. Then a voice came through the walls, not a roar, not fire, but an actual voice, low and enormous and perfectly clear, the way a sound is clear when it comes from something with a chest the size of a room. "I know you are here." Nessa's hand stayed up. Nobody moved. The voice said, "I have read the filing, an interesting technique. Someone with experience in flame court procedure was involved. The passes were also interesting. Natural subsidence does not collapse at two sites within the same night. Still, nobody moved. The voice said, "I want to speak to whoever is responsible." Nessa looked around the room, 8 people looking back at her. She did not think about it for very long. She thought about the sealed water skin in Redmir. She thought about the things you find when you look. She thought about all the times in the last 2 years when she had walked into a place that scared her because there was no one else to walk into it. She put her hand down. She opened the door. The market square of Culvert was not large. Karath was. It did not fit comfortably in the square. Its tail curled up against the far wall, its head extended over the market stalls, and it looked at her from a height that made her feel very specifically like a mouse. Its scales were a deep, uneven bronze, old and layered, the way rock layers are old. Its eyes were amber and they fixed on her immediately and did not move. She walked to the center of the square and stopped. Her heart was doing something she was not going to think about. She said, "I'm responsible." Karath looked at her for a long moment. Then it said, "You are very small." She said, "Yes." It said, "The passes will not stop me. The filing will delay me for perhaps 2 months. Then it will be dismissed, because I will apply the appropriate counter-procedure, which I have done before." She said, "I know." This seemed to give it pause, not long, but a pause. It said, "Then what were you trying to do?" She said, "Make it cost something." Another pause, longer. She said, "You leveled Redmir because it was easy. 4 valleys because it was easy. People lived there for 200 years, and you decided they were less important than what was underneath them, and nobody stopped you because nobody ever stops you, so you never had to think about whether what you were doing was worth thinking about." Her voice was level. She was surprised by this. She had not planned to be level. She said, "We couldn't stop you. We're not trying to stop you. We're trying to make you think about it, because things that never have to think about what they cost stop being able to tell the difference between what they want and what they need." The silence after this was very complete. Karath's amber eyes had not moved. She could not tell what was happening behind them. She had no way to read a dragon's face. She was standing in a market square talking to something 400 years old about the nature of unchecked power, and she was still alive, which was either a very good sign or the pause before something much worse. The dragon said, "You are not afraid of me." She said, "I am completely afraid of you." It said, "But you came out anyway." She said, "Yes." Karath was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then it moved, not toward her, but drawing itself back, head pulling away from the market stalls, the enormous weight of it shifting. It said, "The northern veins are richer, less complicated." She said nothing. She let it be what it was. It said, "I have not had a conversation in 40 years." She said, "That seems lonely." And something happened to the amber eyes then, not a softening exactly, but a change. A small, unquantifiable change, the kind that you see in very old things when they encounter something they did not expect. It said, "Keep your valley." Then it left. The shadow crossed the square and was gone. Nessa stood in the empty market and breathed for a long time. Then she went back inside, sat down on the floor, and did not say anything for a while. Nobody asked her to. Pell sat down beside her. He did not say anything either. After a while, she said, "Tell Weld we might not need the second filing." Pell nodded. He got up and went. She stayed on the floor a little longer and let her hands shake, since there was finally nobody watching who needed her not to. 3 months later, there were 41 people in Culvert who had not been there before. They had come in 1s and 2s from the outer settlements. Most of them had lost something: a home, a livelihood, someone they could not get back. They came because the story of Karath and the market square had traveled the way stories travel in places where people have very little else, quickly, with each telling making it slightly larger than the last. Nessa had not meant to become anything. She was not good at speeches. She was not comfortable with people looking at her like she knew what to do. She said this to Dort, who said, "Everyone who is good at those things is usually the person you most want to not be in charge." So Nessa stayed, and the 41 people stayed, and they turned Culvert into something that had not existed in the outer settlements before, a place that kept records. Not grievances, not propaganda, records, the kind Weld and Dort understood, precise and dated and formal and hard to dismiss. Every settlement that had been emptied, every iron claim filed by a dragon lord without notice or negotiation, every charter clause that had been ignored, every procedure that existed on paper and had never once been applied. It was not dramatic work. It was the kind of work that made your eyes hurt at the end of the day and your back ache from sitting, and it had no immediate visible effect on anything. But Nessa had learned something in 2 years of walking between settlements, and she had understood it more clearly in the market square in front of Karath. Power that has never been questioned does not know its own limits, and a thing that does not know its limits can be surprised by where they are. Ren organized a different part of it. He was quiet about this, the way he was quiet about everything. He had spent 14 years as a soldier, and he understood something about people that Nessa had only begun to understand, that most of them were not cowards. They were isolated, people who believed they were the only one thinking a thought tended not to act on it, people who discovered that the thought was common tended to act very differently. He traveled, he walked the same roads Nessa had walked, and he talked to people, and he did not promise them safety or victory or anything large. He said, "You are not alone in this." He said, "There are people keeping records." He said, "Records are what you need when the moment comes to use them." He did not know when that moment would be. He said so honestly, because he had been a soldier long enough to know that the people who told you exactly when were the ones getting people killed. Pell turned 11. He had been in Culvert for the full 3 months, and he had done 3 things in that time. He had learned to read properly, taught by Weld, who was impatient but thorough. He had become very good at moving between people without being seen, not in a sinister way, in the way of someone who had spent a long time being overlooked and had made a practical skill of it, and he had started keeping his own records. A small book, the pages made from salvaged paper of varying qualities, filled in careful, uneven letters. What he was recording, when Nessa finally looked, was everything she said. She looked at him when she realized this, and he looked back with the eyes that were not flat anymore, that had not been flat for some time. She said, "You don't have to do that." He said, "Someone should." She did not argue. What changed the most in those 3 months was harder to describe. It was not a military change or a political change or anything that would appear in a record. It was a change in how people thought about themselves. Nessa had watched it happen slowly. The outer settlement people she had spent 2 years walking between had always known they were capable of things. They worked hard land and survived bad winters and raised children in places the Flame Court had long since stopped maintaining. But they had understood themselves as separate, which meant small. The separateness had always felt like the truth. It was not the truth. It had been the most useful lie the Order had ever told. A month after Karas left, 2 of the other dragon lords who held iron claims in the outer settlements quietly reduced their extraction schedules. No announcement, no negotiation, just a reduction, unilateral and unexplained. Ben's watchers noted it. Weld filed it in the records. Nessa did not know if this was fear or something else. She thought it might be what Karath had experienced in the square, the first friction from a direction they had not expected friction to come from, not resistance they could crush, resistance they had to think about. For creatures who had not thought about the cost of a thing in centuries, thinking was its own kind of disruption. On the day she decided to go back on the road, there were 8 other settlements she had not reached, and the work was not finished. She sat on the same ridge stone where it had started and looked at the valley below. Culvert was visible, smoke from its chimneys, the market square still standing. The extraction passes to the north were quiet. The sky was clear. Pell sat down beside her with his record book. She said, "You don't have to come." He said, "You said that about Culvert." She said, "I know." They sat for a moment. He said, "What do we do when we run out of settlements?" She thought about this. She thought about Weld's records and Dort's files, and Ren moving quietly between people and 41 people in Culvert who had not been there before. She thought about a dragon saying, "I have not had a conversation in 40 years, and what that meant about the distance between power and the rest of the world. She stood up and picked up her pack. She said, "Then we start somewhere else." She walked down off the ridge. Pell followed. Below them, the valley was alive and still standing, which was not a small thing, and was not nothing, and was exactly the kind of thing you built from when you had nothing else to build from. Which was, it turned out, enough.